I always believed that life had a way of rewarding quiet consistency. I wasn't a millionaire, not a genius, not the kind of man who commanded a room just by stepping into it. I was Ethan Ward, ordinary, predictable, steady, the kind of man who woke up at the same time every morning, brewed coffee the same way, tucked his shirt the same way, and for most of my life I believed that this steadiness was enough. It made me reliable. It made me safe. It made me lovable, or so I thought. Everything changed the day I became a father. The moment I held my daughter, or so I believed, something in me rewired. Her tiny fingers wrapped around my thumb, and in that instant I felt my universe rearrange itself around a 6-pound heartbeat. I remember sitting in the hospital room that day, holding her while Emily rested. The world felt quieter, softer, almost sacred. I had never prayed much, but that night I whispered to God to make me a good father. A better father than mine ever was. The nurses told me I wouldn't sleep much for the next few months. They were wrong. I didn't sleep for years, not because I had to, but because I wanted to be there. Every sound she made became a kind of music. Every cry, every startled breath in the middle of the night, I rose for it happily. Sax, cack, smank, at Sene.m. While the world rested, I paced the living room with her in my arms, humming soft lullabies I made up as I went. I learned the rhythm that calmed her cries, the perfect way to hold her, and how to warm a bottle faster than I ever thought possible. Knessentin Kasserm, I learned what it meant to love with my whole heart, without fear, without limits. People say the first year of parenting is exhausting. For me, it was the first time I truly felt alive. Emily would always smile and say, "You're such a natural, Ethan." She said it often, too often maybe, but back then I thought it was affection. I took pictures of our daughter every single day. I recorded her first smile, her first attempts to crawl, the first time she reached for me. The first time she said Dada, it felt like my entire soul lit up. I saved the audio clip on 4 different devices, terrified I might lose it. I didn't know then that the universe has a wicked sense of humor. I didn't know then that the word Dada had never belonged to me at all. The truth didn't arrive like lightning. It crept in quietly, disguised as a simple medical scare. She was 2 years old. We had gone for a normal checkup, just a fever that wouldn't break. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. I had held her in my arms in the waiting room, bouncing her gently while Emily filled out forms. My daughter, my entire world, rested her head on my shoulder, her small hand gripping the collar of my shirt. She trusted me completely, loved me without question, and the weight of that love made me feel invincible. Until the doctor walked in, his expression wasn't alarming, but it wasn't routine either. He flipped through her test results with a strange hesitation, like a man trying to decide between honesty and politeness. He asked Emily a few questions about her medical history, questions she answered too stiffly, with details that didn't sound rehearsed but carefully chosen. At the time, I didn't think much of it. People get nervous around doctors. Then he turned to me. "Mr. Ward," he said, "could I speak with you privately, just for a moment?" I felt a small shift in my chest, like the beginning of a storm. Emily didn't react, not in surprise, not in concern. She just looked resigned. And I didn't understand it then, but that look was the first crack in everything. The doctor led me across the hall into a small consultation room. It was quiet, too quiet. A ticking clock on the wall broke the silence, each second landing like a hammer. He closed the door gently, sat down across from me, and folded his hands. "Your daughter is stable," he began. Relief washed over me. "But," he continued, "there's something we need to clarify." He hesitated, searching for words. "There are certain genetic markers missing, markers that should be present based on your family history." I blinked, unsure what he meant. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Ward, biologically speaking, this child cannot be yours." In 5 seconds, that's all it took for my world to collapse. I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to shake his head, to admit he'd mixed up files. He didn't. His eyes were calm, too calm, prepared. I felt a buzzing in my ears, like static swallowing my thoughts. "That's impossible," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "There must be a mistake." The doctor slid the papers toward me. I didn't understand half the terminology, but the conclusion was brutally clear. Not mine, not by blood, not by biology. Coke and Manente, the rule of the universe I had trusted. What rules of Sir Trustert Nidok Castor? Not by the rules of the universe I had trusted. My throat tightened. "Does your wife know?" he asked gently. Those words felt like a knife, because I realized in an instant, yes, she did. And somewhere beneath the shock, beneath the disbelief, something darker began to stir. a shadow that had slept inside me my entire life. It wasn't anger yet. It was too cold for that. It was the beginning of knowing I had been living inside someone else's story, someone else's lie. When I walked out of the consultation room, everything felt different. The hallway looked the same, the chairs the same, the muted colors the same. But the air was heavier, the world quieter. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Emily stood just outside the examination room, our daughter still in her arms. When she saw me, she knew instantly. Not because I said anything, but because guilt has a way of recognizing itself. Her eyes darted away, and that told me everything. I walked toward her slowly, like a man approaching the wreckage of a car crash, shaken, terrified, unable to understand how something so familiar had suddenly become unrecognizable. She tried to speak. I could see her lips tremble, but she said nothing. Our daughter reached for me, whining softly for her father, her real father. I took her in my arms anyway, because love doesn't disappear just because truth does, but something inside me had cracked hairline at first, nearly invisible. A fracture small enough to hide, but deep enough to destroy foundations. The nurse smiled at us as we passed, unaware that she was witnessing the final moments of a family that never really existed. We didn't speak in the car. Emily stared out the window while I drove in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Rage hadn't arrived yet. Rage is loud. Rage is hot. Rage hadn't arrived yet. Rage is loud. Rage is hot. But what I felt was cold. Ice cold. Controlled. Almost surgical. Emily knew what I had learned, and she also knew I wasn't going to explode right away. She had counted on my calmness for years. She had relied on it. That was her mistake. Because calm men drown deeper, calm men break silently, calm men plan. That night, after our daughter fell asleep, I sat on the living room couch, staring into the dark. Emily approached slowly, like a fragile animal inching toward a predator. She sat across from me, twisting her wedding ring between her fingers. "I was going to tell you," she whispered, my jaw clenched. "When?" I asked. She didn't answer. Silence settled between us. A thick, suffocating silence filled with all the confessions she would never speak. Her eyes were wet, not with remorse but with fear. The fear of a woman who had finally run out of places to hide. She whispered my name softly, Ethan. But I didn't respond, because the man she married wasn't sitting in that room anymore. Something had shifted. Something irreversible. I looked down the hallway at our daughter's bedroom door. Her nightlight cast a soft golden glow across the floor. The same glow that had filled my nights with purpose for 2 years. And now that glow twisted like a cruel reminder of the truth. I had spent 2 years loving someone else's child. But the real betrayal wasn't the lie. It was knowing she watched me fall in love and stayed silent. Grief comes in waves, shock comes instantly, but betrayal arrives slowly, like poison creeping through veins, paralyzing everything it touches. As I sat there, I felt something inside me harden, a decision forming, quiet, sharp, inevitable. This wasn't over. Not even close, because Emily didn't just steal the truth, she stole 2 years of my life. And I was going to take everything back, piece by piece, starting with the truth she thought I could never handle, and ending with the one truth she would never see coming. The man she betrayed wasn't the man she would face next. Not anymore. The house was quiet the night I returned, but it felt alien. Every creak in the floorboard sounded sharper, every shadow deeper, every sigh Emily drew heavier than it had ever been. I had walked these halls 1,000 times before, celebrating birthdays, laughing at her jokes, sharing quiet dinners, but that familiarity no longer comforted me. It felt like a stage, and I had finally noticed the cracks in the set. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, my eyes tracing Emily's movements. She moved like she always did, graceful, deliberate, controlled. But something was off. She hummed softly as she prepared our daughter's bottle, the sound light and casual, yet my stomach twisted. That hum had once lulled me into comfort. Now it seemed rehearsed, mechanical, and meant to cover something far darker. I watched her from the shadows. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it quickly. A twitch in her expression she must have thought I wouldn't notice. I did. Her thumb danced across the screen as though trying to erase a trail, something she had never done before. Something deliberate. My pulse started to rise. Not with anger, not yet, but with recognition. Recognition that the life I thought I knew was a lie. I had known her for years, married her for 2, raised a child in what I thought was a cocoon of love and trust. And yet, every late-night work call suddenly felt like an ambush waiting to happen. Every unexplained absence became a question mark that screamed in my mind. Every smile that once reassured me now hid something poisonous. I sat in the living room pretending to read a book, but I wasn't reading, I was observing, I was cataloging. Because for the first time in my life, I realized that trust is a currency, and Emily had been spending it in ways I could never repay. It started small, a misplaced text on the coffee table, half erased, addressed to someone named Caleb. I knew nothing of him, just a name, a number, and a hint of betrayal. But my instincts, honed by 2 years of shared life, told me that curiosity could no longer remain idle. I pocketed my daughter's pacifier, moved to the bedroom, and scrolled carefully through her phone when she left to check the laundry. There they were, messages that didn't belong to a husband and wife. Words dripping with intimacy, laughter, and plans she had made without me. Names intertwined with pet nicknames, secrets shared in a language meant to exclude me. And Caleb. Caleb Morris, someone she had dismissed for years as just a coworker. The realization hit me harder than I expected. This wasn't a mistake, this wasn't a fleeting lapse in judgment, this was long-term, calculated, hidden in plain sight. I put the phone down slowly, as though it were a loaded gun, and I felt something shift deep inside me. Not rage yet, not fully, not the fire that would eventually consume me. This was colder, sharper, a cutting edge beneath my skin that whispered, watch, learn, wait. Over the next several days, I became a ghost in my own home. I watched her, noting everything, how her eyes lingered on Caleb's name in her phone, how she tensed when certain emails arrived, how she smiled at nothing when I was around. I followed her habits like a scientist studying an unknown species, documenting patterns, observing inconsistencies. At night, when our daughter slept, I pieced together fragments, receipts for late dinners, unexplained credit card charges, emails sent and deleted. Every lie she had spun, every truth she had hidden became a thread in a web. And I started to see the shape of it, clear, cruel, and breathtaking in its audacity. She had loved me in a way, perhaps, but not enough to tell the truth. Not enough to preserve the life we had built, and I realized that love, when absent honesty, becomes a weapon. She had wielded it against me quietly, artfully, and for far too long. I found myself replaying moments in my mind. Her hands brushing mine while we cooked dinner. Was it affection or a practiced gesture? The way she laughed at my jokes, genuine or a mask for something else? My memory became a battlefield. I had to separate reality from performance. And as I did, a new clarity emerged. This was bigger than anger, bigger than heartbreak. This was about survival, about understanding the full scope of the betrayal before I acted. And there, amidst my analysis, I noticed something else. Caleb was meticulous too. The messages were brief, coded, leaving little trace. Every call she answered was masked as work. Every meeting she attended in secret had a plausible excuse. I realized then that she had planned this carefully, intentionally, knowing exactly how far she could go without me noticing. And for 2 years it had worked. I let myself sit with that knowledge for a night, long after Emily had fallen asleep. I held the phone in my hand, traced the words with my finger, and let the anger simmer beneath the surface, pour beneath the surpass. Patience and to campanture would be amateurish, I'd wished and patience and to strategy, controne. It wasn't yet time to confront her, that would be amateurish. I needed patience, I needed strategy, I needed control. The following morning, I woke early while Emily and our daughter still slept. I brewed coffee slowly, savoring the warmth, the ritual, the calm before the storm. I watched her through the bedroom doorway, noting how she moved through the room like a woman who believed herself untouchable. And she was right. At that moment, she didn't know I knew. She didn't know that I was seeing her, analyzing her, understanding her. I made my first decision I wouldn't confront her. Not yet, not while the power was still hers. I would observe, document, and gather evidence. I would understand her desires, her patterns, her weaknesses, and then the game would begin. I felt a cold excitement, a sense of clarity that I hadn't known I possessed. My heartbreak had transformed into something sharper, something deliberate. Pain had given way to strategy. Betrayal had given way to calculation, and somewhere deep inside, a new man was emerging, patient, meticulous, unrelenting. I began researching Caleb Morris carefully, quietly, without leaving traces. Social media, public records, subtle questions to mutual acquaintances. He had a life that mirrored mine in some ways, a successful career, a seemingly perfect family, married, publicly respected. Privately dishonest, the kind of man who thinks a lie will never catch up to him, the kind of man who underestimates the quiet, observant men who once loved completely and now watch carefully. Every fact I learned about Caleb became a tool, Every habit, every pattern, every weekend getaway he bragged about online became ammunition in a war I hadn't declared yet, but one that was already underway. And Emily continued to smile, unaware that her perfect little secret was unraveling in the hands of the man she had betrayed. Days turned into weeks. I observed her interactions with Caleb's messages, noting how she would hide her phone when I entered the room, how her eyes would flicker toward the clock during calls, how she would suddenly become affectionate only after seeing me notice nothing. Every movement became a puzzle piece. Every inconsistency became proof. At night, I sat in silence, going through screenshots, emails, and fragments of conversations. I made spreadsheets of dates, times, locations, receipts, anything that could build a map of her secret life. And through it all, our child, remained at the center. Every plan I conceived had to account for her, protect her, but also wield the truth as a weapon against the adults who had betrayed her innocence. I realized then that my heartbreak had a purpose. Betrayal had given me a focus I had never known. Love had made me blind, but truth made me sharp. And the woman I thought I knew. She was no longer the person I had married a stranger. A stranger who had walked into my life, stolen my trust, and built an alternate universe behind my back. And now I would learn every secret she had kept, every hidden corner of her double life, and I would turn it against her. The transformation was subtle. I smiled more genuinely, spoke more softly, became more attentive than ever. I pretended ignorance with a precision that made Emily overconfident, reckless even. She revealed herself in ways she had never done before, small confessions to herself, careless glances at my reactions, unguarded moments that hinted at guilt and fear. And in those moments, I began to piece together the timeline. Caleb, Emily, weeks, months, years of deception, everything stacked neatly like a blueprint of betrayal waiting for me to read it. I was no longer a husband who had been betrayed. I was a man planning for something bigger than confrontation. I was a man who would reclaim control, quietly, completely, and finally. The first chapter of my revenge hadn't even begun, but the stage was set. The woman I thought I knew had shown me her true face, and the man who had loved unconditionally now learned what patience could accomplish. The heartbreak that once threatened to destroy me had transformed into a weapon, and the weapon would be precise, deliberate, and devastating. Because betrayal, once understood, is never harmless. It is a tool, a path, a promise, and I intended to follow it. Caleb Monroe had never imagined that a funeral could feel like a beginning. Most people think of funerals as endings, grief, closure, the final chapter. But when he walked into the small church on that rainy afternoon, the world felt off-kilter. The air was thick, heavy with scented candles and the murmurs of mourners, yet there was an unnatural quiet that made him uneasy. Something was wrong, though he couldn't put his finger on it. The coffin sat at the front of the church, pristine and polished, the kind of display you see in movies about perfect lives unraveling. And there she was, or at least the image of her, Emily Monroe, smiling in a photograph, wearing a red dress that he remembered from their first date years ago. The irony of it all wasn't lost on him. She had been perfect to everyone around her, flawless, graceful, beloved, and now she was gone, or so they said. Caleb had been summoned here not by grief alone, but by something else, a whisper of suspicion, a nudge of intuition he couldn't ignore. The police report, brief and clinical, called it a tragic accident. A car had skidded off a wet road and collided with a tree. Simple, final, clean, but Caleb knew better. He had been around Emily long enough to know that life doesn't often end so neatly, not when people are careful, not when lives are built on secrets and lies. There were details the police ignored, or were forced to ignore. The first clue came from the funeral program itself. It was ordered from a high-end printer, expensive, glossy, the kind of program you don't see for someone who dies in an accident on a rainy night. Then there was the list of attendees, faces carefully curated, powerful people, business associates, and a conspicuous absence of the one person who should have been there, her employer. And that's when Caleb started to notice the story unraveling in front of him. He left the church early, walking under the cold drizzle, the photograph of Emily in his pocket. His mind was racing, dissecting every detail of the accident report. Something didn't add up. The tree wasn't on a blind curve. The car's skid marks were inconsistent with a loss of control. Witnesses reported seeing a shadow near the vehicle, someone running away after the collision, and then there was the employer. Richard Holloway, a man whose wealth was built on decades of secrecy and manipulation, a man Caleb had respected professionally only because he never knew the full story. Richard had been absent from the funeral, citing pressing business matters. Caleb knew better. The realization hit him like ice water. This wasn't an accident. Emily had been eliminated, and not for any personal reason, but because she knew something dangerous, something that could destroy Richard Holloway's empire. Caleb didn't panic, not yet. Panic is the response of a man without a plan. He felt the cold click of resolve in his chest, in Nash Charest. He had seen betrayal, he had felt loss, and now he would meet secrecy with patience and precision. He began quietly at first. Small steps. He went back to Emily's apartment, tracing her recent calls and emails. Her desk had been wiped clean, but not thoroughly enough. Caleb found a notebook she had left behind, filled with cryptic annotations about finances, transfers, offshore accounts, and the name Holloway scribbled repeatedly in frustration. It was enough. Enough to understand that she had stumbled onto a secret that had festered for decades: embezzlement, fraud, manipulation. She had planned to expose it, perhaps anonymously, perhaps through legal channels, but she never got the chance. And now Caleb felt a fire that had nothing to do with grief. It was purpose. He made a decision. He would dismantle Richard Holloway's life, slowly, carefully, and methodically, from the inside out. He would infiltrate, observe, manipulate, and strike at the exact points that mattered most. Weeks turned into months. Caleb became invisible, a shadow in the corridors of Holloway's empire. He took a consulting position that gave him access to meetings and documents, a role carefully crafted to avoid suspicion. By day, he appeared ordinary, polite, professional, unassuming. By night, he pored over financial reports, internal communications, and private schedules. Every detail about Holloway's empire became a weapon. He discovered the cracks first in the people around Richard, loyal employees who had their own ambitions, weak points that could be exploited, resentments that could be amplified. Then he turned to Richard's personal life, his isolated children, his secret lovers, his health vulnerabilities. Everything was connected. Everything had a point of leverage. Caleb was careful not to act recklessly. He moved like water, silent, patient, undetectable. Every action was calculated. Every smile, every handshake, every casual conversation was a potential step closer to dismantling a man who had killed Emily without consequence. And yet there were moments when he faltered. Late at night, he would find himself staring at her photograph, wondering how her laughter, her stubbornness, her intelligence had been stolen from the world so cruelly. A part of him longed for revenge that would burn everything to ash in a single moment, but he knew that was amateurish. Real power is slow, deliberate, psychological. He began leaving small hints, anonymous notes, suggestions planted to unsettle the people around Richard. Leaks in the financial reports here, small errors there, subtle pressure on employees who could be manipulated. It was like setting dominoes, each piece arranged perfectly, waiting for the first to fall. One evening, Caleb attended a private charity gala, the kind Holloway threw to polish his image. He wore a tuxedo and a mask of calm perfection, blending in with the crowd of elites who had no idea their world was quietly unraveling. He watched Holloway move through the room, oblivious, commanding, confident. But Caleb had already infiltrated his empire in ways Richard could never anticipate. Every financial irregularity, every hidden transaction, every secret email, was known. Every move Richard made would now play into Caleb's hands. It was the first night Caleb allowed himself a small smile. A ghost was haunting Holloway's life, and he was the ghost. The first domino fell months later. A carefully timed leak exposed discrepancies in Holloway's company finances. Enough to cause internal panic, but not enough to trigger external scrutiny. Caleb watched from the shadows as Richard scrambled, trying to maintain control. Employees whispered, rumors spread, and Holloway's confidence began to crack. Caleb did not intervene directly. He remained invisible, patient, calculating. He let the panic build, feeding on it like a predator. Every move Holloway made to fix one problem created another, and Caleb was always there, watching, waiting, adjusting. It became clear to him that this slow-burn dismantling was far more satisfying than immediate retaliation. There was poetry in the patience, there was justice in the method. Caleb's resolve hardened. Emily had been silenced, but her discovery would not be in vain. The man who thought himself untouchable would soon realize that shadows have memory, that ghosts can strike with precision, and that even the most secure empires have cracks waiting for someone patient enough to find them. And Caleb was patient, Caleb was methodical, Caleb was inevitable. The funeral that shouldn't have happened had marked the beginning of the end. The art of revenge is never about rash action. It is about control, patience, and the careful orchestration of events that others believe are ordinary. Ethan Ward understood this better than most, now that betrayal had taught him its cruelest lessons. The child he loved was not his, the woman he married had lied for years, and yet outwardly he had to appear. Ordinary, loving, perfect. The very last thing Emily would suspect was that the quiet man she took for granted, the one who continued to smile and care for her, was the architect of a slow-burning storm she would never see coming. And so he wore the mask. For weeks Ethan perfected it. He rose early, brewed coffee, and prepared his daughter's breakfast just as he always had. He asked about Emily's day with genuine curiosity, and he smiled at her jokes, the same soft, encouraging smile she had relied on for years. He even went so far as to compliment her cooking, her outfits, her hair, each word carefully chosen to reassure her that all was as it should be. Behind this facade, however, he was methodical. Every movement, every conversation, every glance was observed, recorded, and analyzed. Every lie Emily told himself and others became another piece in the growing tapestry of evidence. Her audacity increased with his silence. She began to act with reckless confidence, believing that he remained unaware. She answered late-night calls with hushed whispers. She left her phone unlocked when she thought he wasn't watching. She smiled at Caleb's texts with a sly satisfaction, assuming Ethan would never notice. And he did notice. Ethan had always been a man of detail, and now his skills had a sharper purpose. He had learned to see patterns where others saw chaos. The dates of her secret meetings, the time Caleb would call, the subtle inflections in her voice, all became a timeline he could reconstruct with frightening accuracy. He began taking notes in a journal hidden under his bed, diagrams of her movements, schedules, and patterns. But observing alone was not enough. To dismantle Emily's carefully constructed world, he would need allies, people she would never suspect. His first step was to contact lawyers and private investigators discreetly. He presented himself not as a man bent on vengeance, but as a concerned husband seeking clarity. His calm demeanor and precise, measured questions earned him cooperation without raising suspicion. Through them, he began to verify everything he had already observed, ensuring that every detail was grounded in fact rather than assumption. Then came Lena's unsuspecting wife. Meeting Lena was delicate. Ethan approached her under the guise of casual friendliness, a neighborly concern for her well-being, and curiosity about her husband's recent behavior. Lena, naive to the affair, shared her worries freely, late nights, vague excuses, sudden absences. Ethan listened, asked subtle questions, and guided her toward a realization that aligned with the truth, without ever revealing that he knew more than she could imagine. Through Lena, Ethan gained leverage. By nurturing her suspicions and directing her attention to Caleb's movements, he turned her into an unwitting ally. She began noticing the inconsistencies Ethan subtly highlighted, growing uneasy about the man she loved. Now, it was a delicate dance, but one that paid dividends. While Emily and Caleb believed themselves secure in their secret, Ethan was quietly engineering the unraveling of their worlds from multiple angles. At home, the mask required perfection. He laughed with Emily, held their daughter, and even suggested weekend trips and small family outings, all while noting every detail of Emily's reactions. Each smile, each hurried glance at her phone, each flicker of guilt in her eyes became data points. Every moment built toward the crescendo of their eventual exposure. Ethan learned to speak softly, to agree when necessary, and to allow Emily's overconfidence to grow. By acting the perfect husband, he gave her the false comfort of invisibility. She would make mistakes now, confident that he was blind, and those mistakes would be the key to dismantling everything she had worked to conceal. It was psychology at its finest, the predator pretending to sleep while the prey wandered closer to the trap. He began planting seeds of doubt in both households. Small remarks, casual observations, and hints at subtle infidelities created a ripple effect. He mentioned, offhandedly, things he heard or noticed to Lena, letting her imagination fill the gaps. In the Ward household, Emily began to sense an intangible change, a quiet intensity in Ethan's demeanor she could not place. His kindness no longer felt casual, it was purposeful, precise, and measured. Even Caleb, far away, would feel the influence of Ethan's work. Emails sent at strategic times, phone calls deliberately observed, and the slow seep of information through Lena would unsettle him in ways he could not immediately detect. Caleb's confidence, once absolute, began to fracture without his awareness. Ethan understood the long game. He did not rush. He did not act out of passion. He allowed time out of passion. He allowed time to serve him. He was patient. He was meticulous. Days turned into weeks. Emily's boldness grew as she believed Ethan's silence meant ignorance. She spoke freely, laughed at moments that had once been private, and even flirted subtly with Caleb in ways she imagined Ethan would never notice. Every word, every gesture, every glance was noted. Every misstep became part of a larger record that Ethan would use when the time came. He recorded conversations discreetly, documented every text, every email, every whispered admission. Every lie she told became evidence, a weapon to wield with surgical precision. He became a silent observer in his own home, cataloging betrayal in real time. And all the while the mask remained intact. Ethan found satisfaction in subtle manipulations. A remark to Lena here, a question in passing there, a carefully worded observation over dinner, small nudges that would ripple outward and disrupt the delicate equilibrium Emily and Caleb had cultivated. He learned to trust that the world could be moved with small, deliberate pushes rather than grand, obvious gestures. Each day brought a new layer of understanding. He discovered Caleb's routines, the patterns of their secret meetings, and the way Emily relied on them for emotional support. Through observation and quiet manipulation, Ethan gained leverage over both. He understood now that true power lay not in confrontation but in shaping reality, so that those who betrayed him would unknowingly participate in their own downfall. The mask was exhausting. Every smile required calculation, every gesture required purpose. Yet the exhaustion was a small price to pay. Every day Ethan became more adept, more patient, more capable. He learned to enjoy the irony of it. The woman who thought she had deceived him completely was now acting in ways that only reinforced his strategy. The man who thought he had power over another would soon learn how fragile control truly is. And as Ethan watched Emily laugh with a careless freedom, he felt a quiet, unshakable satisfaction. The clock was ticking, the pieces were falling into place, and the perfect storm of truth and revenge was approaching. The mask was no longer a shield, it was a weapon. And in the stillness of the night, as their daughter slept between them, Ethan plotted the next moves, understanding that the culmination of patience, observation, and subtle manipulation would be far more devastating than anything hasty or impulsive. The household was unaware, the players oblivious, and the web around Emily and Caleb tightened silently, invisibly, inexorably. He had become the man he never wanted to be, the patient architect of ruin. And when the world finally collapsed around them, it would do so in a way so precise, so complete, that no one would ever forget it. Because masks, when worn long enough, can reveal far more than faces ever could, and Ethan had perfected his. Ethan Ward understood the power of patience, but he also understood the power of timing. All the careful observation, every whispered conversation, every hidden camera, every planted thought was now converging toward a single purpose. The time had come to test the strength of the web he had spun. To see how fragile the illusion truly was, he began with subtle leaks. Anonymous messages, hints of discrepancies in shared accounts, bank alerts that appeared inexplicable, all carefully curated to create doubt. The idea wasn't to confront Emily or Caleb directly. Confrontation was primitive. The goal was psychological pressure, a slow, suffocating squeeze that would leave them questioning everything and everyone around them. Nack Kemper kom messen Trompransen Tonchermack. The first message arrived on Emily's phone, a photo of Caleb, taken from a distance, in the park with someone she hadn't known existed. No caption, no sender, just the image, a whisper of doubt, a senahav of doubt, a seed of panic. She stared at it for hours, her mind racing through every scenario, every conversation, every private moment with Caleb, now suspect. She couldn't explain it. She didn't know who could have sent it or why. Ethan watched her from a distance during the day, pretending to be absorbed in work, attentive to the baby, calm, loving, but inside a storm was gathering. Every flinch, every look of fear, every whispered call Caleb received without explanation played into his growing satisfaction. Caleb, too, began noticing small disruptions. Emails that were deleted almost instantly, financial alerts for minor sums transferred from accounts he had assumed private, subtle inconsistencies in the home security system. At first, he dismissed them as mistakes, the occasional glitch of technology. But as the days progressed, a pattern emerged. Something or someone was watching. The paranoia that Ethan had anticipated now began to take root. Caleb's confident exterior cracked ever so slightly during meetings, at home, in private calls. He began double-checking everything, retracing steps, questioning Lena subtly in ways that were both casual and insidious. And Ethan, always watching, smiled silently behind the perfect facade of a devoted husband. Lena, increasingly unsettled by her husband's distracted behavior, began asking questions. Small, innocent inquiries at first. Did you see this, or are you sure about that? But soon, the weight of the anomalies, the financial irregularities, the strange absences, and Caleb's evasive answers compelled her to confront him directly. It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that leaves streets glistening, reflections distorted, everything appearing more ominous than it truly is. Lena stood in the kitchen, her eyes sharp, the first flicker of suspicion that Ethan had carefully nurtured finally manifesting as action. "And Caleb," she said quietly, "what's going on? I know you're hiding something from me." Caleb froze. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, panic starting to cloud his once unshakable confidence. Every carefully hidden detail of his affair, every calculated lie he had relied upon for months, now seemed perilously close to exposure. And Ethan, sitting silently in the house next door during a routine check-in, monitored the chain reaction with a precision that made the chaos almost beautiful. Emily, oblivious to Lena's confrontation but increasingly aware of subtle pressures from the outside, began to sense that her perfect secret was no longer secure. Her calls with Caleb became tense, guarded. They whispered, plotted, and reassured one another, but even their most intimate conversations were now infected with doubt. Every text, every photo, every alert planted by Ethan fed the paranoia, creating a tension that was impossible to escape. Her desperation became visible. She grew jittery, pacing through rooms, talking to herself when she thought no one was listening, checking her phone obsessively. And Ethan, always present, maintained the perfect mask. He laughed with her, held the baby, even suggested outings that appeared spontaneous but were carefully timed to allow him to observe her reactions to planted information. As the weeks progressed, the cracks widened. Lena, emboldened by the clues Ethan had subtly provided, began investigating further. She discovered evidence of Caleb's duplicity, receipts, odd transactions, messages that could not be explained. The confrontation that Ethan had anticipated was now inevitable. The first argument erupted on a Sunday morning. Caleb tried to defend himself, but Lena's anger and betrayal were fueled by a collection of small, undeniable truths. Ethan, aware that the conflict was unfolding as planned, remained distant, silent, a ghost behind the scenes. He did not need to intervene. The web was working. The lies, carefully nurtured over years by Emily and Caleb, were now collapsing under their own weight. At the same time, Ethan began to escalate pressure on Emily. He produced financial documents, carefully selected and stored over months, that exposed inconsistencies in her accounts. Small, seemingly minor irregularities, a sudden withdrawal here, a payment there, could be explained individually, but together they painted a picture of deception and manipulation. Emily's panic grew. She realized that the life she had carefully constructed was now suffocating her. Every attempt to cover her tracks only deepened the impression of guilt. Every lie she told herself became more fragile, more transparent. Ethan watched as she stumbled, frantic, desperate. She attempted to call Caleb, but the trust between them had already eroded under the weight of subtle manipulations, planted doubts, and constant surveillance. Arguments erupted, whispers of betrayal that had been carefully guided by Ethan's strategic interventions, and the perfect illusion of their relationship began to shatter. The psychological collapse was precise. Emily and Caleb no longer trusted each other fully, even in private. Lena, now aware of her husband's duplicity, confronted him in ways that left him scrambling for excuses, explanations, and control. Friends and colleagues, tipped off anonymously with select pieces of evidence, began questioning Caleb's integrity. Ethan remained invisible. He appeared to be the loving, concerned husband, the attentive father, the man who had been betrayed, but in reality, he had orchestrated a chain reaction that no one else could have foreseen. The tension reached its peak when Emily discovered that some of her financial missteps, carefully monitored and preserved by Ethan, could no longer be concealed. Panic set in. She realized that the net had tightened, that her life was now being scrutinized in ways she had never imagined. Her attempts to manipulate and placate failed because the observer was always one step ahead. The pressure became unbearable. She screamed at Caleb in private, only to realize that he was now defensive, insecure, and vulnerable. Their alliance, once unbreakable, was splintering under the combined forces of Ethan's patience Lena's investigation, and the subtle chaos that had infiltrated their lives. Ethan, meanwhile, prepared for the final strike. He did not rush. He allowed the disintegration to continue, knowing that each fracture would make the eventual collapse more complete, more satisfying. He cataloged everything: messages, arguments, financial missteps, admissions of guilt, and waited for the perfect moment to reveal the full extent of his knowledge. By the end of the chapter, the illusion of perfection had been shattered. Emily and Caleb were no longer partners in crime. They were isolated, paranoid, and vulnerable. Lena, once oblivious, had become aware, questioning every facet of her life and her husband's choices. And Ethan, patient and meticulous, stood at the center of it all, the architect of a plan that would culminate in absolute justice. The perfect lie had collapsed, and the final act of retribution was approaching. The air in the courtroom was heavy, almost electric, charged with the kind of tension that could be felt in every corner of the room. Ethan Ward sat in the back, perfectly composed, as though he were merely attending a routine hearing. But this was no ordinary day, no ordinary trial. This was the day when every lie, every betrayal, every secret that had haunted him for years would finally be revealed, and the perfect illusion that Emily and Caleb had maintained would shatter like glass. Ethan's hands rested lightly on his lap, but his mind was meticulously orchestrating each moment. Every piece of evidence he had collected over months, years even, was in place. DNA results proving the child was not his. Recordings of Emily and Caleb's conversations, captured when they believed no one was listening. Financial documents, meticulously cataloged, showing fraud, deception, and manipulation. Emails, messages, and photos that together painted a portrait of calculated betrayal. He watched Emily from across the courtroom. She looked composed, confident even, as if the years of duplicity had earned her immunity from consequences. Her high-heeled shoes clicked against the floor as she strode in, her eyes briefly meeting Ethan's, flashing with the kind of arrogance only someone who believes themselves untouchable could possess. And then, slowly, meticulously, he let the first domino fall. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence first. The results were irrefutable. Emily's attempts to manipulate paternity, to control the narrative of their family, were exposed in a single, unassailable moment. The court murmured, disbelief rippling through the gallery. Emily's face, once so carefully maintained, faltered slightly, a twitch in her eye, a slight tightening of her jaw, the first crack in her armor. Ethan remained composed. Ethan remained calm, composed. He did not gloat, he did not smile. There was no satisfaction in spectacle. The satisfaction was in inevitability, in the precise unraveling of deception he had anticipated for months. Next came the recordings. Every whispered conversation, every clandestine meeting, every lie Emily had told him, and the world was laid bare. Caleb's voice, once confident and unassailable, now faltered as he realized that his duplicity was undeniable. His career, his marriage, his carefully curated public image, all dependent on secrecy, was now under the bright, unforgiving light of truth. The courtroom was silent. The judge's gavel, when it struck, sounded like a death knell for the world they had built. Emily attempted to interject, tried to spin excuses, to redirect blame, but Ethan had anticipated every maneuver. Every lie she had rehearsed was already countered by meticulously preserved evidence. Her credibility evaporated with each passing moment. The whispers of the townspeople who had once admired the perfect couple grew louder. Faces that had smiled and nodded now looked shocked, betrayed, and vindicated on Ethan's behalf. Caleb, too, was unraveling. Lena, seated in the gallery, watched as the husband she had loved, trusted, and defended was exposed not only as unfaithful but as morally and financially corrupt. She felt a mixture of rage, grief, and vindication, but Ethan's careful planning ensured she would not act impulsively. She was aware, but she was also guided to see the truth in a way that cemented the impact of Ethan's strategy. By the time the financial evidence was presented, the final layers of deception were exposed. Bank transfers, fraudulent claims, manipulated accounts, all revealed in a cascade of data that could not be refuted. Emily's attempts to justify minor discrepancies failed under scrutiny. Caleb's involvement, previously hidden, was laid bare. The two of them, once confident and arrogant, now sat pale, silent, and powerless. Ethan watched, noting every flicker of emotion, every flash of panic. He did not gloat. There was no need. The slow-burn revenge had reached its culmination. Justice was no longer theoretical. It was absolute, undeniable, and complete. Outside the courtroom, the townspeople whispered. The perfect couple admired for years were suddenly understood in their true light. Betrayal, deception, and greed, the traits they had hidden behind smiles and small-town charm, were now exposed for all to see. Shock was palpable. People who had once looked to Emily and Caleb as symbols of stability now recoiled in disbelief, their admiration replaced with caution, anger, and pity. And Ethan, he stood apart, a quiet observer of the fallout. The child he still loved, the innocent soul used as a pawn in the adult's game of deceit, remained the only reason he restrained himself from total vengeance. He would protect her, love her quietly, but he would never allow her to be a weapon again. In the aftermath of the court proceedings, Caleb's career imploded. His clients withdrew, colleagues distanced themselves, and the press, once unaware of his duplicity, pounced on the story, ensuring that his public image was permanently damaged. Lena, now empowered by truth, confronted Caleb directly. Their marriage, already fractured by betrayal, could not survive the revelations. Emily, meanwhile, faced not only public humiliation, but also legal consequences. Her lies, carefully constructed for years, had been systematically dismantled. She attempted to salvage her reputation through media statements and public apologies, but the evidence was overwhelming, the betrayals too deep, and the townspeople's judgment too resolute. Every step Ethan had taken, every moment of patience, every observation, every planted doubt had brought them to this point. The slow, methodical plan had worked exactly as intended. For Ethan, there was no celebration, no triumph in the conventional sense. The satisfaction lay in the inevitability, in the meticulous orchestration of justice, in knowing that every lie, every betrayal had been exposed without haste or recklessness. The mask he had worn for months, the loving husband, the devoted father, had served its purpose perfectly, allowing the truth to emerge in its most devastating form. And when it was over, he walked away quietly, unseen by the press, unnoticed by the crowd. He had ensured his legal protection, secured his daughter's well-being, and reclaimed control of his life. But he did not gloat, he did not boast. He had achieved the ultimate satisfaction, the knowledge that truth, patience, and precision had conquered deceit, betrayal, and manipulation. The final days were spent severing ties cleanly. Ethan ensured that Emily and Caleb could no longer influence the child, that their capacity for harm was neutralized, and that his own life could continue with dignity. He distanced himself physically, knowing that love for his child did not require exposure to the very people who had weaponized her innocence. In quiet moments, he allowed himself reflection. The anger, the heartbreak, the betrayal, all of it had been transformed into strategy, patience, and justice. He thought of Emily's smiling face when she first deceived him, of Caleb's confident voice, of the years of manipulation, and he felt a profound sense of closure. Justice, Ethan realized, was not instantaneous, it was not flashy, it was deliberate, and when wielded carefully, it was absolute. The townspeople, too, finally understood. The perfect couple was gone, exposed for what they truly were. Gossip, speculation, and revelation spread through the streets like wildfire. The admiration they once enjoyed was replaced with shock, pity, and understanding of the depth of their betrayal and of the quiet, unassuming man who had ensured it could never harm anyone again. Ethan did not seek recognition, he had no desire to be celebrated. He only wanted what had been stolen to be accounted for. The years of trust, the quiet life, the manipulation of his heart and home. And in the end, he had achieved it. The final strike had been delivered, not with rage, but with precision. Not with chaos, but with order. Not with vengeance that burned recklessly, but with the calm inevitability of someone who understood every thread of deception, every hidden intention, every betrayal. The truth was now visible to all, the lies unmasked, the betrayers exposed, and Ethan Ward, though scarred, cautious, and vigilant, could finally step into a life reclaimed. And the child, innocent amidst the ruin of adults, remained protected, loved quietly, and safe from the shadows that had once threatened to consume her. The mask had been removed, the perfect lie had collapsed, and justice, long delayed, had been served in its most complete and satisfying form. Ethan Ward walked away from the courtroom, from the shattered lives of Emily and Caleb, and from the whispers of a town that had finally glimpsed the truth. Yet the air around him did not feel lighter. Justice had been served, revenge had been executed with surgical precision, and yet the cost of all that precision weighed heavily on his chest. Yet he had dismantled 2 lives built on deceit and betrayal. He had revealed every lie, exposed every secret, and left the architects of manipulation with nothing but the ruins of their own making. And still a quiet ache lingered, the loss of the child he had once loved as his own, the innocence of the life that had been used against him now carried away by circumstances he could not undo. Ethan had ensured her safety, arranged for her to remain with caretakers who would love her, protect her, and shield her from the darkness that had once crept into their home. But the separation, though necessary, was a wound he could feel every day. The sound of her laughter, her tiny footsteps, the softness of her hand in his, it all haunted him in fleeting moments, reminders of what had been stolen by betrayal. He walked through empty streets, the sky above gray and heavy, as though the world itself were reflecting the weight of the past months. Each step was deliberate, a meditation. The world had shifted irrevocably. Emily and Caleb were no longer the perfect couple admired by the town. They were flawed, exposed, and powerless. The court of public opinion had delivered its own justice, relentless and unyielding. Yet Ethan knew that justice, when exacted with method rather than fury, carried its own loneliness. There were no cheers, no accolades, no triumphant shouts. The satisfaction was quiet, cold, and deeply personal. It was the knowledge that he had survived betrayal, outmaneuvered deception, and protected what truly mattered, all without compromising his own moral center. In the quiet of his apartment, Ethan reflected on the months of observation, patience, and subtle manipulation. The long nights spent recording conversations, the careful documentation of financial discrepancies, the deliberate planting of doubts in Emily's and Caleb's lives. It had all led to this moment. Every careful calculation, every silent watch, every minor sacrifice had contributed to the inevitable collapse of their perfect illusion. Yet, even amidst the satisfaction, he could not ignore the bitterness. The betrayal had cut deep, leaving scars that would never fully heal. The woman he had loved, the man who had betrayed his trust, the child who had unknowingly become a pawn. They were reminders of the fragility of human relationships and the devastating power of deceit. Ethan thought of Emily, sitting in a small, cold apartment she had been forced to occupy after the legal and social fallout. Her carefully curated image destroyed, her credibility shattered, and her once proud confidence replaced by fear and uncertainty. She could not manipulate her way out now. Every lie had been exposed, every secret revealed. And Caleb, once so confident, so untouchable, was left to face Lena, to answer for every betrayal, every manipulation, and every deception. His professional reputation was in tatters, his marriage irreparably damaged, and the public's trust long gone. The empire he had built on lies was now crumbling piece by piece. Ethan's revenge had been complete, and yet it was not loud or violent. There had been no screaming confrontation, no impulsive acts of rage. It had been precise, patient, and inevitable, a dismantling of lives conducted with the cold certainty of a winter storm. He allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection, thinking of the child he still loved. The bond they shared had been real, authentic, and untainted by manipulation, yet circumstances demanded distance. He would not fight for custody through anger or desperation. He had learned that control over one's life is not found in possession, but in the quiet knowledge that one has protected what matters most. Ethan smiled faintly, a small, private acknowledgement of the paradox he now lived with. The loss of what he loved most had been the catalyst for the most precise justice he had ever executed. Pain had become strategy, heartbreak had become clarity, and betrayal had forged him into someone capable of methodical, unyielding action. The town around him began to return to normal, though whispers lingered. People spoke in hushed tones about Emily and Caleb, speculating on the depths of their deceit. They marveled at Ethan's composure, his resilience, and his quiet strength in the face of betrayal. Yet most did not know the full extent of the work behind his calm exterior, the months of careful planning, the nights spent observing, the patience required to allow the perfect moment to arrive. He had carried the burden alone. He had witnessed the slow disintegration of lives from the shadows, guiding events with subtlety and precision, ensuring that the final outcome would leave no doubt, no escape, no chance for redemption for those who had betrayed him. Ethan considered what it meant to move forward. Freedom was now his, yet it was tinged with loss. The child he loved would always be part of his heart, a reminder of both the betrayal he endured and the resilience he had forged. Emily and Caleb had lost everything, and yet they remained alive, left to reckon with the consequences of their choices, forced to face one another amidst the ruins of the life they had built. Ethan's victory was quiet, understated, and deeply satisfying. It was a justice that did not rely on spectacle, that did not require the indulgence of rage. It was a demonstration of patience, intellect, and moral clarity, the ultimate retribution for betrayal. And in the stillness of the evening, walking alone through the streets he had once walked with Emily and their child, Ethan allowed himself of final reflection. Some betrayals break you. Others shape you. Mine did both. He felt the weight of every lesson, every scar, every sacrifice. The years of manipulation, the heartbreak, the slow burn strategy, and the patient observation had all culminated in a justice so complete, so precise, that it could never be undone. He had carried the burden alone. He had executed revenge with clarity, with intellect, with purpose. He had dismantled lies, exposed deceit, and protected the innocence that had been threatened. And now he could walk forward into a life defined not by betrayal, but by the knowledge that he had endured, outmaneuvered, and ultimately prevailed. The cold wind whispered past him, carrying away the remnants of the past, leaving only the clarity of the present. Ethan Ward, scarred but wiser, free but solemn, stepped into that future, alone, vigilant, and unbroken. And in that solitude he understood the ultimate truth of his journey. Some betrayals break you, others shape you. Mine had done both.